Hello, everyone. You are listening to SheLeads with Carly. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky, and my guest today is Jay-Z. Jay-Z is nothing short of incredible. She runs product teams, advises startups, and teaches product management at Stanford University, a course in which I was very, very grateful to be her student in. She's currently the vice president of product at Webflow, a SaaS company for website building and hosting. Previously, she worked in senior product roles at incredibly well-known companies, including Dropbox, WeWork, and Airbnb. In Jay-Z's spare time, she renovates houses and runs after her 2-year-old son. And occasionally, if she has the time, she does make handmade cards, which you can see on her website, obviously built with Webflow. But anyway, you guys are in for a treat. I am so excited. Jay-Z, I'm so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for joining.
Of course. I'm so excited to be here. Ever since I saw that you were doing this podcast, I was like, oh my gosh, Carly, and all the people she gets to talk to.
Oh, now you're one of them. I'm so excited. First of all, set the scene. Where are you in the world? What's your work setting like? What's going on?
I'm based in San Francisco. I'm currently in my bedroom, which I cleaned because there's no virtual background for this call. We are in a pretty small apartment, my husband and I, and our son. And so we are going to be moving, but in the meantime, we're just making it work.
Amazing. I think a lot of people are in the same situation. So it's weird times right now. Yes. So Jay-Z, I'd love to go all the way back to Yale. You graduated in, I believe you studied economics. And that's right. Take me through this process of, graduating with an economics degree. I'm guessing that product management wasn't in your mindset at this point, but how are you viewing your career? What was going through your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I, at the time, honestly didn't even know that product management was like a discipline or a job. So I graduated with an econ major. The natural thing to do with an econ major was essentially, at the time, banking or consulting. And I really preferred consulting, I think, for two reasons. One, the idea of being able to go really broad and learn about all these different industries. And also specifically, I did have a passion for, energy and economics. That's something I really studied. So I joined an economic consulting firm in DC where they were doing a lot of energy work. But very quickly, I realized economic consulting was not for me. It was very much looking in the past and trying to figure out, Google is suing IBM, what are the damages owed? It was really prepping these expert witnesses, and I wanted to be doing something that was much more forward looking. So this is pretty wild when I think about it. I made my first job switch in 9 months. I was like, this just isn't for me. Wow. And so I got my second job in strategy consulting, being like, I want to be doing something that's more forward thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so 9 months, which it's actually kind of funny because probably back then, staying at a company for 4 years, that was the norm. Whereas even today, it's kind of shifting in a sense, right? Like a year, 2 years, now people are trying to, trying to find their new thing. I don't know, maybe it's coming full circle in a way.
I mean, totally. I remember breaking the news to the partners at the firm that I was going to leave, and they were in shock. They had been there for many of them for 20, 30 years. And they were just like, you've been here for 9 months. Are you sure? Yeah. And I was like, I am really certain that this isn't for me. So I joined a strategy consulting firm. I was much more interested in future looking, do these companies merge? How do you think about this industry? But at the same time, I also felt like something was missing there, in the sense that I was advising, I was spending all this time doing all this research and then prepping this deck and being like, hey, I hope they, take the recommendation. And I just really craved to actually be building and operating. And so ultimately, that's what even got me to start looking and then discovering this concept of product management.
Okay, so walk me through that. I believe your first product management role was in Pocket Gems, which became a top 10 mobile apps game. So walk me through that. How did you find it, and how did you, get your foot in the door and get that role?
Yeah, so, at the time I was living in Boston, and I was like, I want to be building. What does that look like? I learned about the product management role, and then at the same time, I also learned that to get one was very difficult. You had to have a CS degree, to really go through the training. The places that offered it were like the Googles of the world, And so I was like, I have none of those things, but I really would love to do this job. What can I do? At the time, gaming was actually on the rise. This is when Zynga was, in its heyday. And what I thought about was like, well, I have all this analytics background, like skill set, like econ, consulting, running all these models. How do I really lean into that skill set? And gaming really embraced it because, at the end of the day for gaming, it was really about analyzing almost like the game economy, running these A/B tests. It was very, very analytical. And actually, I make this joke where back in college, I took micro and I was like, when am I ever going to use this? This is like not useful at all. I was like, macro is way more interesting. And then, when I was actually working on a game, I was like, oh, this is what micro is all about. But so at the time when I looked around, I was like, I don't want to just go to a Zynga. I want to go to a much smaller place where I could feel like I'm really making a difference. And I specifically also wanted to learn about mobile. I really believed at the time that mobile was the future. And this was a time where, again, Facebook really wasn't even on mobile. But I was like, everyone has a mobile device. It's taking off. Like, I can't imagine a world where, like, people aren't building for the phone. And so that's how I found Pocket Gems. It was almost like a startup version of Zynga that specifically focused on mobile games. And so that's how I applied. And I was like, I'd really love to work here.
Wow. Okay. So one fascinating thing that I want to talk to you specifically, given this story, is right now, I'm sure you know that, most PM job descriptions are either, these APM programs, new grads right out of college. And then it seems like there's pretty big shift to that versus, 5, 7+ years of experience. And so it's almost like, okay, where do those fit in the middle where, they came from consulting or engineering or these, maybe more technical backgrounds? How did you kind of sell yourself? How did you position it that you can be a product leader for this company? And like you said, like it was a very early company. You were kind of, the only one maybe. So how do you have advice in that sense for kind of pushing through it in that middle?
Yeah, for sure. I think that a lot of times it does come down to luck and really finding that particular company that's willing to take a chance on you. So for sure, there are all these at this point, and by the way, this was not true back then. There really weren't that many APM programs. There was literally just Google's, and it was, I think, even before Facebook had fully established their RPM program. Yeah. But today, I think, to your point, if you're a new grad, there are APM, RPM programs that you can apply to across a bunch of different companies. I think for a lot of the people who do go through that, they do end up staying at those companies for a certain period of time and then making a transition to a different company. A lot of people who don't get a chance to go through an APM or RPM program, what they do is, we talked a little bit about this during class, is they will join a startup who's, again, willing to take that bet on them, where they're like, I don't exactly have a PM program for you, but I have all these needs. I have, no one talking to our users. I have no one really working with our engineering team. Like, they have all these needs, and what you essentially can do is you can go into those companies and say, actually, what I can offer you is essentially a product manager role, but I will be wearing multiple hats, at once, or maybe like a few more hats here, and then I'll shift my hats. And so I think that flexibility is key, and then finding a company that's willing to take that risk.
Okay, so what do you think then about the idea of joining an early startup, wearing multiple hats, but you're also new? Like, you're new in product, you don't really have product experience per se, and yet you have you might be like the first product hire. How do you balance that? I'm sure it sounds daunting, it sounds exciting, there's a lot going at it.
Yeah. That's definitely been something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And one of the reasons, Anand, I obviously know him. We teach together at Stanford. But we've also done more than just Stanford. We now have a course on Reforge. And the reason is because at the end of the day, it is an isolating experience to be that first PM or to be a PM or even figuring out what PM is at your company without, formal training, without a manager who has that experience, without, that system at your company. It's really hard. And so I do think it's really important from a teaching perspective and a learning perspective to have those materials out there where you can be like, hey, well, I can take this course with Stanford, or I can actually be part of this cohort with Reforge and learn and almost create like a peer group, even if at your company you're the only person doing that thing.
Yeah, okay. I love it. Also, we'll get into it later, but I even looked at our notes that I took in your class, which, by the way, for any Stanford students listening, I have to say, like, one of the best classes at Stanford. And I don't say that lightly. Maybe it's because I'm passionate about product, but you and Anand, you do it so well. So I really recommend it. It's amazing. And like you said, like that class, I do feel ready. Like it does give you the tools, and it's very like tangible. It's real tools rather than just like this theoretical approach. So anyway,
we wanted to be hands-on. We grade
Exactly.
everything, and we just really wanted to be an experience where you're truly learning.
Yeah, amazing. So, okay, now you're at Pocket Gems. How was this experience? First product role, were you imposter syndrome a little bit? Was it challenging but also exciting? What was going through, during this time for you?
Yeah. Definitely, you always experience imposter syndrome, but I think I was so busy that I didn't even have the time to feel it. At a mobile gaming company, or especially at Pocket Gems, that was quite small, it was, you're kind of fighting for your life every single week, especially in your game, running Paradise Cove and the live ops model for it. Like, I was responsible for especially how much money that game made every single week. And that involved shipping to the App Store every week with updates. So there'd be new features for, players to play with, uploading, like creating a system to actually upload downloadable content so that can be pushed anytime. So I was learning so much. I loved it. It was just truly the best learning experience, like really getting to own that product lifecycle end to end, really deeply understanding. Like, I do truly even today feel like gaming is one of the best teaching grounds for learning things like, how do you maximize like the lifetime value of a particular product? How do you think about customer acquisition? You can't just build something and hope people will come. You have to eke out every single user you're putting into your game and retain them and engage them. So it's a master class in really just like all the metrics, all the different and again, some things have like almost like unhealthy meanings behind them, like the gamification, for example. Like, it's almost like a dirty word these days. But if you do it really well and thoughtfully, it's not a bad thing. You're actually engaging people. So I just think that it's one of the best training grounds, even to this day.
Yeah, I really love that perspective in a way, because I actually talked to someone on my podcast, Vanessa. She started off in a gaming company and then went on to start her own company. And when you think of gaming, you're like, okay, isn't it a bit, unethical, making it very addictive, like all these different factors that can come into it. But your perspective, I love. It's like, getting in the feet of the user. It probably gives like this incredible sense of like, what does the user want? What will keep them engaged and excited, which is great.
Yes, and you're 100% building for a user that is not yourself. And I think that's one of the biggest fallacies for a lot of people when they go into product. They have all these preconceived notions of like, this is useful, this is amazing. Therefore, like, of course, if I do this, then people will use my product. But at the end of the day, you have to really separate yourself from the user. And gaming is a perfect environment for that, because there's no way I would ever pay, anything for a mobile game. And then, here I was, literally finding what the industry called whales, right? People who would pay like a large amount of money, a huge, like honestly, like unbelievable amount of money for like different in-app purchases. And just really being able to like look at your game, look at your user usage, and be able to think through, okay, well, what would someone enjoy who is not me? I think it's a really great training ground. That being said, like some of the things you said around this whole, like, it's almost addictive, it did wear on me. And that was one of the reasons why, after a few years there, I was like, I've learned so much. But at the end of the day, I was personally craving working on a product that was, in my mind, a little bit more like net additive. And that's actually, there were two big reasons why I went to Dropbox. One was to work with the best engineers. This is where I think imposter syndrome really played a big role, where I was like, I've learned a ton at Pocket Gems, but I do not feel like I've worked with the best full stack, like everything engineers. How do I go to that environment, go to a place that is engineering driven and still be successful and like have a lot of impact? And then coupled with that, I think there was a part of me, when I reflect on it, it's like, well, did a lot of things to decrease productivity. Dropbox is a great way to increase productivity. I can kind of atone for my sins there.
Wow. Okay. I was just going to shift to Dropbox, and I love, so you mentioned that, connecting to engineers. And I think, as you said, like even today, there's a big talk around technical background, and, a great product manager has technical background. And I've learned it definitely depends on the product, it seems, in the company. But walk me through this journey of yours, specifically working with, the top engineers at Dropbox, also without a technical degree, studying econ, and maybe at Pocket Gems you got a little more of it, but what was that like?
Yeah. What I learned at Pocket Gems was very different than what I needed to be at Dropbox. And so I actually, this was a big moment for me. When I joined Dropbox, I was like, I want to work on the most technical product that I can possibly get my hands on, because am nervous. I do feel like I have this like imposter syndrome that I really want to overcome. And so I asked to be put on the developer platform team. And at the time I was like, I don't even know what an API is. I like had to Google it.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, like am I ready to go like work on this product and work with these very strong engineers? And so, decided it was really important. And so I did it. And it was a really amazing learning experience. And one of the biggest things that I took away was at the end of the day, again, going back to this thing where it's like, if you're too close to the user, sometimes what happens is you kind of like impose your own biases and perspectives. And it's actually really, really refreshing and really good for the business and good for your users to not be so close. So what happened specifically on the developer platform team, the developer ecosystem team, was I didn't have that technical background. And so, I didn't come at the product with like, of course, like developers should do this. And of course, like this should be easy for developers to learn. I came at it with like a completely open mind, really. And as a result, I really looked into the data. I spent time talking to developers, all types of developers, to understand, were they actually happy with the products that we were launching and with what we were hoping to do? And actually had a huge learning. And that learning was, Dropbox engineers thought that the developers out there in the ecosystem were a lot more technical and willing to do a lot more work than they were actually willing to do. So we were spending a lot of time working on something that was kind of like the sync API, which was pretty complicated. And I think within Dropbox we're like, well, this is like Dropbox's secret sauce. So of course people would want this from us. But people were like, I don't like the idea of like using something like yours for sync versus just using whatever I already have in place, that's like a big technical hurdle and a big obstacle. Instead, they're like, I just need you to give me things like a chooser, a saver, like a way to pick things from Dropbox and put it in their app, or a way to save things from whatever was happening in the app into Dropbox. That's all they wanted, and they wanted that API or that SDK to be like a 10-minute plug and drop and then be done. And I think that without that without those conversations, without even having that almost like, I have no idea what you want, so therefore I'm really going to dig deep, we wouldn't have gotten there. We wouldn't have known like this is not worth the investment, and it's better to invest over here where this is what our users actually want.
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting. It's also the first time that I've learned this emphasis on decoupling from the user, because in a way it doesn't sound intuitive, because as a PM, it's all about the user and focusing on the user, talking to the user, hearing the user. And so many people probably think like, you start to be the user like as much as you can. But it's so interesting to hear this perspective, like, no, actually coming without this technical background, going to developers, it helped you even that much more because you were listening, like you had no baseline to base it off of. So it's great.
Yes. It's critical to steep yourself in the user and immerse yourself in the user, but it's really important to do that without biases.
Yeah.
To come with an open mind, to be like, I just want to understand, like coming from a point of, all I'm trying to do here, I'm not trying to build you something. We're not there yet, right? Like, Carly, you and I, we talked a lot in our class about the difference between the problem space and the solution space. Like, it's so easy to jump into the solution space when you have those preconceived notions of like, well, you probably would want something like this, right? Versus just being like, I have no idea what you want. I really don't. I just want to understand who you are, what problems you're struggling with, what challenges you're dealing with. That's when you steep yourself in the user, and then also keep those like your own opinions and points of views at bay.
Yeah. And okay, I have to go back. You said it so casually, this idea where you had imposter syndrome, and yet like this is why you joined Dropbox. You not only joined Dropbox, but you joined the developer platform, which takes it to another level. How did you deal with this imposter syndrome? How did you deal with it?
Yeah, I think the one big thing was really just understanding the value you bring to the team, and the value you bring has nothing to do with your technical background. Like, you as a product manager, there's literally a whole team of engineers who are infinitely more technical than you. Even if you were technical, even if you had a CS degree or whatever it is, their job is to be technical and to understand like how to do something and all the different options. So I think really just being clear in your roles and responsibilities, where you're like, my job is to help the team understand what's important for the business, what's important for the user, and then guide the team through this building process to ultimately get to the best solution and then work with other teams out there, to really bring it to market. That's your role. Your role is not to be technical, and really internalizing that, understanding the differences in the roles and responsibilities, and feeling almost the freedom of like, my job is not to be technical. In fact, it's anything but. I think that's huge. And then the last piece of advice I'd offer is it's really about asking good questions, right? So again, I think you need to be you need to learn enough, and I don't call it like technical enough. It's more like you need to learn enough about your product. You need to learn enough about your tech stack, enough about, what the engineers are thinking about to be able to ask the right questions so you can make sure that you're making the right trade-offs. Because oftentimes the first thing that's thrown out there is like, hey, this is the best way to do X, or this is the fastest way from A to B, is usually not what you end up with. And so a big part of your role is asking the right questions and guiding people to that outcome, as opposed to being like, hey, I'm supposed to know the answer of how to do this technically.
So now from Dropbox, you obviously worked at incredible companies, well-known companies, ones that are doing incredibly well, including Airbnb, and then you went on to work at WeWork. And obviously, became head of product, senior head of product. I'm curious, what was going through your mind with all these new career shifts? Was it the title? Was it, reaching a higher level of leadership and new opportunities? Was it the company, the passion of the product? What came into it?
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely say it wasn't the title, in the sense that when I joined Airbnb, I think they didn't really have major gradations between the PM roles. It really, for the majority of my career, has been driven by learning and a passion for the product. So when I joined Airbnb, similarly to how I joined Dropbox to really work with the best engineers, I really wanted to work with the best designers. And it wasn't just like from a, oh, that'd be nice perspective. It was because during my time at Dropbox, I learned what it was like to not have first principle design thinking and product thinking, right? It was very much almost like this like solution-driven thinking, where I was like, wouldn't it be great if this existed? Instead, what I really wanted to be in was a culture where it was like, well, what does the user really care about, and how do we build something that like delights them? And I felt like Airbnb really did that well, and I also knew how strong of a design culture they were starting to build. And so that's why I ended up joining Airbnb to, again, work with, the best designers, and not just like visual designers in my mind, people who are like first principle thinkers, and like, how do you as a product manager partner with a designer like that? So that drove me to Airbnb. And then actually what drove me to WeWork, again, was also from a learning perspective and a curiosity perspective. During my time at Airbnb, I did get the feeling, I worked on a lot of projects where I was like, the operations muscle is not super strong. And it's not expected to be strong, right? Like Airbnb is not a managed marketplace. They're a very unmanaged marketplace. They're a platform. But I was like, WeWork has really interestingly cracked this like operational muscle. I mean, I was floored, and even to this day, despite everything that's happened, quite floored by how quickly they expanded operationally. I think they really had that nailed. But technology was a very, very early thing for WeWork. It was like they're still at the phase of like, how does technology really influence, how we grow, what we do? And that was really interesting. So I optimized for learning, working with this at this company that had this really interesting ops muscle. But also, again, later in my career, I also optimized for impact, feeling like I had actual experience that would be interesting and useful to a company, right? That was, for example, just getting the technology pieces in place. And then what drove me to Webflow was like actually feeling like, okay, it's time to really just own all of it. I feel ready. And then I'm ready to have that impact through all the things I've learned, yet still learning, given that this is a new role for me at the time.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. It's so interesting. I love this. Can you talk more about, it seems like throughout your whole career, you've been incredibly intentional, right? You go to Pocket Gems even, and then you want to work with engineers, so you go to Dropbox, and then designers, you go to Airbnb. And you mentioned already, like, optimizing for learning. I think, can you talk a little bit more about this aspect of, kind of even giving advice to those, at different stages in their career when they're thinking of their next opportunity? I think people maybe think of, I need to get this role in order to get this role in 5 years. But what advice do you give in terms of optimizing for certain things?
Yeah. I think to the point of like, I need to get this role so I can get this other role, it's really hard to know where the industry is going. So I think it's if you're planning that far ahead, the chances that something comes up and changes, it's quite high. Right. What I do believe in strongly is, especially early in your career, you should optimize for two things: learning, which we've talked a lot about, but also network. How do you surround yourself? And there are interconnected, right? So like, how do you surround
Right.
yourself with the best people, the smartest people, the people that you can learn from, the people that you can exchange ideas with, and like collaborate on, that you want to be around? That facilitates this concept of being able to learn. So when you optimize for learning, for network, and you're not optimizing for things like, I don't know, financial, optimizing for finances, or optimizing
Right.
for even brand, you get so much more, right? Like, Pocket Gems compared to Zynga back then, completely different in terms of what the brand looked like. But I learned so much more working at Pocket Gems. I owned so much more Pocket Gems. I literally owned a whole game that was, like all the pieces of it, as opposed to if I worked at Zynga, I'd own only just a little piece of a game, right? So I think a lot of that is, how do you just steep yourself in an environment where you're going to be pushed to do more than you're comfortable every single time.
Yeah. I recently heard in a recent episode the term uncomfortably excited, and I really like that, because it's this idea of like, you're excited, but it's also there will be a lot of learning, which seems like a perfect mix.
Totally.
So,
I actually tell people on my team this all the time, when they're struggling. Actually, if you don't feel like, there are often times when we're like, oh, I think I really did this wrong, or I failed at this, you're probably not pushing yourself or putting yourself at that edge enough. If you're like, oh, I just did this well, this was no big deal, like I crushed it. Are you actually putting yourself into that zone of discomfort where you are growing as much as you can?
Yeah. So at each of these, Dropbox, WeWork, Airbnb, how much of your personal passion for the product came into it? Was it a big part?
It has grown over the years, right? So when I first joined, again, Pocket Gems, I had very little personal passion for gaming. And it was all about just like, this is a place that will give me that opportunity to learn. I had, over time, that's grown. When I joined Dropbox, I had affinity for the product. When I joined Airbnb, I had an even stronger affinity and really believed in the world that we're trying to create. Even today, I still believe in the WeWork product. Again, lots has happened to the company, but I see a future where that product will continue to get used. And where I am today, and I think this is part of that natural evolution of one's career. I mean, please don't tell Vlad this, who's my CEO, but I would work at Webflow even, if I didn't get paid, in the sense that the mission that we're out to accomplish, which is to empower everyone to create, is just so inspiring and also so personal, in the sense of like we talked about, I was an econ major. I don't have the skill set to go build something beautiful. But that's where the world is going. Everyone needs a digital presence. Everyone needs the ability to build and create. And that is something that I believe is intrinsically human. Like, there will be autonomous vehicles, and like, will you need Uber drivers anymore? Who knows? Instacart shoppers? Who knows? But in the future, like, everyone's still creating businesses, creating, like a portfolio, creating, all of these things. And so that's never going to go away. And to be able to democratize access to that platform and that, like, tooling is really, really exciting. So over the years, it's been a lot more about like, how do I just work on things that I personally care a lot about, that I want to see in this world? And I think that's a natural evolution for a lot of people. Right.
And I think it goes hand in hand with your shift in what you're optimizing for. Originally learning and network, all that stuff, and then became more impact and like what is making a difference. Exactly. I love that. So once you became, VP of product now at Webflow, what was that shift like? Was it a seamless transition? Were there some, growing pains of being a VP? What are some key differences from maybe, director or head of product?
Yeah. It's so interesting. A lot of people talk about these titles, but it's really just about the scope of work. So, when I first, came to Webflow and I, looked at the team, I was like, this is a smaller team than I've run previously before at like a WeWork or Airbnb. That being said, I have a lot of responsibility in that it kind of starts and stops with me, right? Like, there is no like, oh, but the company direction was this and my manager said this. It was just like, nope, you're it. You're in that seat. You're that executive. So I think like what is important is you never want to get totally out of your skis, and you probably wouldn't get hired for something where people are like, I don't know, is this person going to be successful, right? But usually what happens is, you find that sweet spot of like, people want you to do the role because they have confidence that you can do it well for XYZ reasons, like, done a similar scope of work, actually bigger. But that being said, for me, it was also a lot about learning, right? Which is like, to have that full responsibility, that is a new thing. And then over the years, I've taken on a lot more functions. I don't just lead product management. I also lead product design, research, like a whole ecosystem team that has like developer relations and BD. And so what I am doing constantly, and I think this is just personally very important to me, is I'm constantly learning, constantly thinking about like, oh, this is a brand new function that I've never worked with before. How do I build this from scratch? How do I make this iconic? And that learning is continuous.
Yeah. So you mentioned how basically as a VP, the title, whatever it is, right now with you at Webflow, you're kind of the beginning and the end. And so you're thinking of, strategy, the business roadmap of Webflow, but also the product and the more, granular aspects. When prioritizing features, how do you play those two hand in hand? Because like say you have a bunch of feature requests from users, and obviously the user is important, but how do you also play in like, okay, Webflow wants to be this, they want to go in this direction in a year or so. How did those come in hand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a question that every product leader is thinking about all the time. The way I think about it is at the end of the day, you have to start with where you're going. You have to start with your North Star. That means, what is your company's vision? What's your company's mission? Ultimately, what do you believe are the biggest steps that you're going to take in order to get there? And then I think when you start getting down into this is a really important investment area for us. How do we do it? The how? A lot of that is in deep partnership with your user base, right? And again, even determining your vision, your mission, and some of your strategy will involve so many data points from your user base. But that being said, you can't be in a world where all you're doing is responding to your users, because what they see is just what they see in front of them, which is like, hey, this is the product today. I would love if this improved or that improved or this was different. But what we're trying to do is something much bigger than that. We're not just giving them the product that they have today. We're trying to build, for Webflow, the world's most powerful visual development platform. That requires strong vision and strategy of how we're actually going to do that. And then the build process itself is one that is deeply steeped in the user.
Okay, yeah. So one thing that always comes up is this idea of alignment, right? And you, on your teams, you have engineers, you have designers, and they all have different motivations, different, things that keep them motivated at work. And I know you even taught this in our class about this rowing metaphor. So is everyone rowing together? And if you step away, does it still go? Does it still work seamlessly? So I'd love for you to talk about that and like this importance of alignment on your team.
Yeah. In many ways, I do think of the product role as like the coxswain, right? So if you are on a rowboat, the coxswain is just helping the team kind of be in sync and get the most out of everyone. If they weren't there, like people can still row. It's not like without the coxswain, you're like unable to steer the oars. But that being said, really being able to say this is the direction we're going. Let's really make everything efficient. That's a big part of the role. So I think a lot about, and we talked about this in class, like, what is your immediate team and how do you make sure all of them are rowing in unison? A lot of that has to do with, do they have clarity on the problem you're trying to solve? Do they have clarity on what success looks like? Because at the end of the day, if they have clarity on those two things, they can be the ones coming up with the ideas of like, how do we do it? Hey, what if we did this from a design perspective? What if we designed it this way? What if we did this from an engineering perspective? What if we actually took this shortcut? Like, it will save us this much time, but it delivers as much value, if not more value. Your designers, your engineers, all the other functions on your immediate team, they're going to be the best people to know those answers, but they can't come up with those answers if you do not frame for them where are we going and what does success look like. Right? So that's a big part of your job. And then there's also the coordination beyond your immediate team. Anytime, and we talked about this, just because you build a great product does not mean it's going to be successful. A huge part of it is taking it to market. So I believe in a very strong partnership with all of those functions, marketing, sales, again, depending on kind of like the makeup of your company and how you go to market, you have to be really in lockstep with all of them to successfully get your product in the hands of users in a way that really delights them and inflects the business.
Yeah. Have you ever, in your previous companies, whether Dropbox, WeWork, Airbnb, or Webflow, have you ever had tension in the sense of an engineer is very demotivated, say he gets a design spec and, it's way too many designs and it has to be for this sprint. I don't know, making it up. But has it ever been where, one of the players on the team is very demotivated and a little upset because there's some misalignment?
Of course. I think it happens all the time. But even in that, hypothetical example you gave, it shouldn't be happening like that. What I mean is if an engineer is literally just getting handed a bunch of designs and a deadline, of course they're going to be demotivated. They're going to be like, what? how in the world did you determine this deadline? How in the world did you determine that these were the most efficient designs, right? Like, did you even think about the engineering constraints here? And so the best way to avoid that is really making sure that people are getting together and working together, again, with the clarity on what their role is, right? You don't want an engineer being like, I think the user is going to experience this better this way. Like, that's actually the job of the PM. And partnering with the designer and even partnering with the user researcher to understand that. Like, that is the input these functions bring to the table. But then for the engineer to be like, okay, I'm understanding these inputs. I'm understanding what you're bringing to the table. Okay, again, this is where we're going. This is what we're trying to achieve. These are my thoughts. I believe that if we did it this way, it's going to be really complicated. And, or okay, we've decided that we're definitely going to do this way. Well, it is hard. It's going to take us time. We believe it's the right thing, but that means we cannot ship in a month. That means we're going to ship in 3. Right. So like having those conversations together, that's what avoids that demotivation.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Okay. Before we get on to some fun questions, I do have one question. So one thing that we definitely focused on during your class is the importance of conciseness, being very concise, writing, in a short way, your PRD, whatever it may be. And actually, in another, I talked to an incredible guest named Sanjana, who you can listen to her episode, and she mentions actually how almost when she talks to engineers and everything, she almost gives these like Instagram Reels, TikTok messaging, where it's so concise that it's just, you can easily understand it. I want to know, what are some tips or advice to improve on this skill, to be more concise?
That's really funny, and I like that. So I think at the end of the day, like, let's start with like why. Why is it important to be concise, right? So a lot of times when you're not concise, people can't get ultimately what you're trying to convey to them, which is essentially like, if you're like, this is all this information, they're gonna be like, but I just listened to that, but I still don't know why we're doing the thing we're doing and what success looks like, right? So I think it's important to know what to be concise on. Obviously, it's a skill that, again, how much we stress it in class. We like edited all your everyone's papers to be like, this could have been done in 3 bullet points and not this like 3 paragraph prose.
3 words. This is 3 words, and we're like wrote a whole paragraph. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's like knowing what's most important to be concise on. I think that's one. Okay. Another thing is, at the end of the day, people have limited attention span, right? Like in class, as your teacher, I have to read your paper. Like, it's my job to give you a grade. But in the real world, people have so much going on and so little time. So if you're like, hey, I want you to read this 10-pager, people are like, okay, maybe later. And then they'll never get to the later. Instead, you're like, this is my 3 bullet point blurb I'm putting in Slack, in email, in every forum that you possibly could look at. They're going to read it and they're going to see it. And so ultimately, it's like, what are you trying to accomplish? You're trying to make sure that everyone's rowing together. Everyone's clear on where they're going. Everyone has internalized it to the point where they are proactively coming up with solutions and ideas, and ultimately you can create the best possible thing. If you do not get that across, you lose out on all of that, right? And so I think remembering, for every single product person out there, or even just person out there, what is it you're trying to communicate with whom? What is their attention span? And how do you engage them truly, where they can internalize that information?
Yeah, I think it also goes hand in hand in almost, scheduling a bunch of meetings and limiting it, and what's worth a Slack message or an email or an actual meeting that you have to schedule. I think it kind of relates.
Totally. We actually, this is pretty radical. A lot of companies do this like synchronous product review. Airbnb, at the size it is today, literally still does it. And a lot of them have Brian, the CEO, in it. I'm a big believer of like, if you are moving that way, you're going to slow yourself down. So how do you do things more asynchronous, but get high signal to noise ratio, right? So we have just a channel where, PMs are constantly encouraged to like be more concise, like have shorter PRDs, shorter, like really, concise, like project briefs. This is what I'm trying to do. This is what success looks like. And it's all there. It's all captured and documented. I think some of the downsides of the synchronous nature of things is you're like, great, we all got into a meeting room together, but it happened to be the people who weren't on PTO, and it happened to be the people who were at the company at this time. Literally fast forward 9 months, the whole makeup of the team looks completely different. What are they going to reference, right? So I think there's a huge part around scaling, around transparency, that when you're doing things more asynchronously and more in a documented fashion, it really helps with that.
Yeah. So when you look at a new product, or when you're experiencing products in your day-to-day, what are some criteria or key things that come to mind that you're thinking of?
You mean in my daily life?
Yeah, in your daily life. What in your mind do you think like, wow, this is a great product? Or, what draws you to a product versus like, no, I don't want to use that?
I think it's interesting where like, a lot of times when I use something just in my daily life, and I think this is again true for most users, you like use a thing, it does the thing you need, it does it elegantly, and you don't think too much about it. And so a lot of times that like what you're describing is almost like this afterthought of like, wow, that worked really well. Or like, the snoo, for example, I was like, wow, this is like elegantly packaged, it's elegantly designed. It just works. Snoo is a thing for rocking your baby to sleep.
Okay.
But, so like in the moment, you're not actually experiencing all these things because again, if something is that well done, you're not like thinking about, actually, I would say I think more about, ooh, this was like a bad design choice when I actually go through something and I'm like struggling. I think less about it from an intellectual perspective if it just works. And then you kind of do that retro where you're like, oh, well, that is interesting. Why was it so amazing? But more often than not, you use something and you're like, this was a terrible user experience. What happened? Why did this happen?
Yeah, it's easier to think in that lens for sure.
Yeah.
So I mentioned in the intro that you renovate houses. So I'd love to know, how did you get into this? And I know you're currently in this process right now. So how is that going?
Yes, we're currently renovating our home to move into because we can no longer fit into this 2-bedroom apartment or fit comfortably. So honestly, the reason I started renovating houses was because it was something that was so physical, like tangible, right? So a lot of times when you're building software, you're like, I built something, but it's a different feeling of building something than if you're like, I've renovated this bathroom or like I've renovated the interiors. And so there's really that almost like desire to, again, continue to build, but do it in a more tactile way. That motivated me to start renovating. And it was really fun. And to be totally honest, I'm a little bit of a like HGTV junkie. And so I think all those things, and I love design. I truly love design. It was a way to really think about design in the physical space. And so that's what really got me started. That being said, with all, work and child, it's hit or like how much you do has kind of like come in ebbs and flows. But now at this point we have no choice in the sense that it's literally our home and we need to move in. And so we are renovating this house during a time where lumber is at an all-time high.
Yes. Well, I have no doubt it's going to look beautiful given you can definitely tell your eye for design. Even like I said, you have done these beautiful handmade cards, which you can see on your website, but they're really fun and they're creative and they're so great. So anyway, I can see it, and hopefully, when your son gets a little older, you can have more time for those. But I have to say, Jay-Z, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. This was a blast.